And so we come to this idea now of I want to get down to practicalities. If you look at sort of the academic work that we've all been involved in, a lot of it is very practical. It's about decision making. It's about sense making, recognition, prime decision making. It is about group dynamics. There's no shortage of academic material. There's no shortage of academic material. I'd like to bring up my screen. I'd like to bring up something now as a quote on this. And then I'm going to ask you, what do we need to do to ensure that the academic richness that we have has an impact? So let me just see if I can bring up my screen. I can. Okay. So I'm just going to read out a quote, and it'll be interesting to hear what you think. 3 decades ago, there was not enough theoretical material or research work on response to social crises and disasters to have warranted more than a footnote attesting to that fact. A paragraph could have summarized all the relevant work and activity of 2 decades ago. Even 10 years ago, several pages might have sufficed to summarize totally the burgeoning activity in the area. The growth of the area has been exponential, not linear. And today the research efforts and theoretical advances have reached such a level as to force us to be highly selective in our coverage of this paper. That was written in 1977, 43 years ago. So we cannot claim that we don't know. The theoretical material is there. We have a phrase in English that says, with all due respect. And if somebody uses the phrase with all due respect, everybody else steps back because this is about to get interesting. I think we have a typical, I don't know if any of, I'm sure that none of you have heard it, I've heard it, but in academia, we have a similar phrase which signifies the same thing, which says, if somebody, Professor Smith is talking and he, giving a lecture, and then you say any questions, you go, and Professor Smith, thank you for your presentation. Interesting theory. And if somebody says interesting theory, then everybody steps back because you are about to start a 40-year war, my friend. But of course, the phrase interesting theory is just a jab. That's just to get the attention. Now you've got to knock the bloke out. And the knockout blow in academia is, Professor Smith, interesting theory, I'm not sure where I see the impact. And if you say I'm not sure where I see the impact, it means who the hell cares, my friend? So you've written a book, you've done a lecture, blah, blah, blah. Who the hell cares? Show me the impact. And I think that, if we take that from Dines and Quarantelli in 1977, 43 years ago, where's the impact? I mean, if we are so good at this, if we've been doing this for 40 years, we've written the books, we've done the theories, we've done the models, etc., etc. Why the hell can we not manage COVID better? Why can't we get decision-making and sense-making and interoperability and the delivery of services and looking after the safety, security, and well-being of our societies better? Given that if we look at the failures, all of the failures that we see are from a classical crisis management perspective, absolutely integral. They are absolutely the failure points we would have expected and we could have identified way before this happened, because they're the same ones that happen on every crisis. So my question is, let's come to you, David. Why are we, or you might say, well, actually we're doing, imagine if we hadn't been here, it'd have been a lot worse. But that's my question. Where is the impact of the stuff that we know? Yes, David, please come in.
Regarding COVID, taking that as an example, if you look back, the scenario for a viral pandemic was fully worked out by 2008. At least that's the year I heard it. If you want to check that, you can simply look up the literature on Google Scholar, and as an impact of the 2002 to 2004 SARS pandemic, then there was a move to create that scenario, and research groups in a variety of countries did that from 2003 until 2009. That was followed and or rather overlapped by a period of emergency planning, which essentially was kicked off by WHO in 2005 and went on until about 2013, when it was put on the back burner thanks to counter-terrorism planning. And in the UK, that was then put on the back burner thanks to Brexit supply chain disaster planning. What we found was that, for example, if you take the UK and COVID, there were 3 major exercises, all of which produced considerable observations on what needed to be done. One of them was EU-based and international, but led by the UK. The other 2 were domestic. And the final one was exercise Cygnus only 3 years before. It identified, for example, in detail, the care home problem. So where was the problem? Well, the planning had been done, at least at certain levels. The UK had a risk register started in 2008 and supposedly updated every 2 years. The latest edition, 2017, shows pandemics as the most likely and the most destructive disaster, as have all the other issues. So what was wrong? Well, there has been an underfunding, an ignoring, and a minimalization of emergency planning and management to the extent that it simply is not good enough. Why is it not good enough? Well, the principal reason, in my view, is because there is a strong gap between what the plans mandate and what is actually possible, which is to say that the plans are simply not capable of being activated. And then what we see this year is a huge amount of improvisation. Much of it leads up blind alleys, which means that billions of pounds or euros or dollars have been wasted. Billions and billions. Currently in the UK, there's a vast amount of personal protective equipment which is simply waiting in the port of Felixstowe because there's no way of getting it out. That is a logistical problem. I also know of someone who has just got COVID in a hospital through lack of protective gear because it just isn't there. Now, these are eminently solvable problems if you have the right people doing the right things to solve them. We knew there was that need. There were means, relatively simple. What is emergency planning? It is codified common sense. It's a tremendous art to be able to codify that common sense, but nevertheless, that effectively is what it is. All of this could have been done and it wasn't done. And that is a matter of political priorities.
David, thank you. I'm going to come back to that point because, of course, the issue about getting this wrong is that has consequences. You know, that is 50,000 deaths plus in the UK. It is millions and millions of infections in the US. These are not failures that you can walk away from. You know, they have consequences. Stephen, you spent a significant amount of time really very, very close to the center of US national policy on this. Were you able to move the dial? I mean, did you move the dial? And the other question, of course, is when you moved the dial, did it stay moved? Or, you know, when you then went away, did it come back again? I can see by your, Stephen, you and me are going to have to play poker one day, my friend, because you're giving it away, let me tell you.
Yeah. Well, you know, I guess it's definitely been a bit of an odyssey. The reality, though, where we are right now is the focus on resilience now is increasingly embedded in national security documents, critical infrastructure focus, cyber related areas and so forth. And this certainly was not the case when I started this odyssey in the mid 90s, where you find there was post 9/11 actually worked against resilience in the US context. There was constantly this mantra that everything has changed. Well, actually nothing changed. We took the existing national security apparatus and we essentially put it on steroids. The focus there was that we could eliminate threat if we had more intelligence, more special forces. Basically, the goal was to identify and destroy. And the mantra in the 90s was, we do it over there, so we don't have to do it here. You know, best defense, offense, take the battle to the enemy. You know, all these sort of sports metaphors. There really wasn't a step back and say, why were we so vulnerable? Why was this so consequential? What can we do to make ourselves less at risk to asymmetric threats? There really was this evolution of we'll just take it out in with the state-centric focus, right? Afghanistan and Iraq particularly. It really was just the evidence finally coming in, you know, by the end of the aughts that terrorism was not eliminated, that it was in fact fragmented, that it had essentially just morphed in different ways, that started to realize, all right, we had to check there. But it was also the adding on of the natural disasters, Katrina being the big one, that everybody acknowledged we couldn't prevent that. You can't prevent hurricanes. You can't prevent earthquakes. As long as they were localized, the federal government didn't care much about them. They would just get a call from a governor if it was really bad. But now that they had to take responsibility for it and they were non-preventable, these are what started to shift a bit to this emphasis on resilience that is now folding over a bit on the national security side. But the forces of basically centralization, when I talk about that professional protector issue, the other derivative fact that worked against the US context for dealing with this was overclassification. That post 9/11 was, we can't let the adversaries know our potential weaknesses, so we classified everything. The result, though, was the actual people who would do something about it were in the private sector or local communities who were not cleared. So how does this work in a democracy? Where the people who have to take ownership for the vulnerability and the response aren't cued in on the risk because the centralized players have classified it. And I used to speak to this in the national security realm. I said, think about this. Your job is to provide for the common defense and the security, and you're basically making sure that nobody will actually invest effort in identifying and actually dealing with these risks because they're unaware of them. And so these are the kinds of disconnects. So has this been solved? Not at all. These tensions are continuing. The goal has to be the decentralization of agency and the improvement of the ability for coordination and providing of strategy and support. And we're still not even close to where we need to be. And the COVID, though, I think that we'll have the benefit of some hindsight on it. With the new administration coming in, is clearly coming in with a different series of perspectives. I think there may be some movement. So the foundations are in place. Whether or not it'll be sufficient, I guess, will be an open question.
And of course, within a specifically US context, you have NIMS ICS, which is a National Incident Management System, Incident Command System, which is incredibly detailed and prescriptive about what you need to do and how you need to do it. And when in Hurricane Katrina 2005, agencies were having to bring in consultants to tell them how they can run, how to run that system. Please, Stephen.
And I guess the core issue there is the almost myopic focus on life safety response is what the incident management system is built around, not necessarily on recovery and adaptation post the event. And in many instances, the response can actually undermine the recovery. Yes. And so that, and therefore put life safety at risk, but just through these cascading consequences. So it's the narrowness of the incident, the definition often, and the focus almost exclusively on life safety versus understanding function and managing system recovery. That's where we're gravitating toward. And that's where we're pushing most along. You have to plan for recovery as much as you plan for response. Yes. And when you do that, you actually get people more vested in mitigation, because when you actually start planning through how do we manage these consequences, most of the time a rational person goes, is there a way to make these less consequential? it brings you in. So it's this failure to really execute beyond and understand, okay, let's play this out. Absent a good reaction, how will this unfold? And if it's really, really bad, that usually leads or should lead or is a driver, motivator for saying, are there things that we can keep to mitigate some of these cascading failures? The other core issue is that we often sort of have this as all or nothing. And so one of the issues I fight with the concept of resilience is everything has to be resilient. Well, then nothing will be resilient. And the answer is no. The stepping off point here is a risk of cascading failure. Not everything will trigger a cascading failure. There are key nodal points that we can model, and network science gives us very helpful tools to understand this. When we have disruption, where will it lead to more loss of function, and will it start cascading to other interconnected independent systems? We don't have to make everything secure. We don't have to make everything, mitigate everything, but we do want to go to places where there's the greatest risk of disruption and try to contain that. And that also helps to prioritize where we go for recovery. because that's obviously going to get us more function back further. So it's bringing these tools to bear, and this sort of the larger theater, where can academia play more of a role? The piece that we've been struggling in academia is for so long is the compartmentalization challenge, and particularly with infrastructure and sectors. And what I saw evolution, and this goes back to the mid-90s in the US context, when we talked about, when we began to really recognize infrastructure was maybe something that needed to be safeguarded. The issue was, well, most of the national laboratories we had said, well, hang on, before we can understand how to safeguard the grid, what are we safeguarding against? And it led to a lot of hazard research. How will this hazard, whether it's wind or extreme heat or whatever? And the others were, well, before we can understand cascading failure, we really have to understand the grid. And so went to a deep dive into the particular sector. And what nobody's doing is actually looking at the connections and the interdependencies across those sectors. And I've been trying to push the reverse saying, I'm agnostic to the shock. I want to map the interdependencies. There will be some shock that will cascade. We should be able to predict how the cascade will behave. Now, some will come with warning, like a hurricane, and some won't, like a terrorist attack or a hurricane. But how it will play out across the system is an eminently manageable scientific problem that could then inform what we do to mitigate and respond. So the tools are there, they're just not being used.
It's an interesting, because I think about it. I'm actually involved in two programs in the UK. One was a Black Sky, Black Start review thing, which was interesting. I'm actually now part of the National Preparedness Commission, looking at sort of how one plays this out. And of course, the thing about it is, to make your point, Stephen, the triggering event is actually relatively unimportant. It's very, very much about consequence management. So when we were looking at the Black Sky, Black Start event, they brought together the heads of the chief resilience officer, chief, whatever it might be, or risk officer of all of the major infrastructures, power, water, transport, food, logistics, blah, blah, blah. And explained, this is Black Sky, Black Start, and this is, what we're trying to do here. And every single one of the chief risk officers says, we've got one of those. We've got a plan. We've been working on that for 2-3 years. And we went, wow, that is really impressive. And I said, tell us what you've been doing. And when it became clear, and I'm sure that all of you have had this experience, all of them have been modeling a Black Sky, Black Start event for their infrastructure, presuming that the other infrastructures were still functional. So they were presuming that electricity worked or transport would work. And we said, no, that's not how it works, my friends. That's not how it works. And I can see on your faces that you recognize, you recognize where I'm coming from here. And you're saying, that's a problem. Patrick, again, we're coming back into, hyper complexity. And there is no, as you said, it's not simple, it is complex. But one of the phrases that I use, I say it is complex and it is chaotic, but it is not random. It is not random. It is, there are patterns in there. And if you understand how it works as a class of event, crisis as a class of event, there are commonalities and there are patterns and there are structures within that, just like there are with the galaxies and the molecular cells, whatever it might be. If you recognize it, then you can engage with it. Patrick, what's your feeling? Do we have the capabilities to sort of engage with those incredibly complex, hyper-dependent, interdependent, cascading problems that we're facing?
Stephen had an organizational perspective. I would perhaps take a psychological perspective. My deep understanding is that when you enter that kind of difficulty, you frighten everybody. And the answer is something like, I was the best pupil, I was the best student, I had all the best answers, and you asked me something like a question, what does it mean? And I remember I was on a NATO conference years ago, and I had in the audience 200 people from the West, and the general who gave me the floor whispered me, please don't frighten them. When you hear that, and I had the same experience in France with prefects, so very close meeting, and I was stopped by the highest person in the room telling me, stop, please, everything is under control in France, no problem. And then during the lunch, he came to me and said, you were right, but you can't say that in front of people in charge. So you understand, it's clearly a problem. And even in the academic world, I had exactly the same. We had a conference in Meadowbrook in the New York State, and years ago, and I tried to open a scenario, and I had instant 3 reactions. The first is that kind of scenario doesn't exist. The second instantly was, yes, perhaps they exist, but everything is under control. And the chairperson sent me back to my chair saying, you are pessimistic. So clearly it was impossible. The only person in the room who would support me was a DHS, Department of Homeland Security officer, telling, they're saying, yes, perhaps it's irrelevant, but I work on that day after day. And Corontelli was sitting just nearby, said, you are right, but you will never convince them. And this is because it's too frightening. Don't tell me that. And I think it's our relationship with Cartesian approach. And I like somebody who is a psychologist wrote a book on about Descartes. And he said Descartes refused totally to work with Pascal on the concept of emptiness, because the idea, he had a beautiful system, but the system is robust as long as you don't ask real questions. Don't ask any question of my system. Don't cripple everything. So I will resist until the end of the times. Don't ask questions, please. We are here. We have the best answers. If you have that kind of culture and a psychological environment, you can't go on. And to answer your question, are we going to convince people? As long as you have this kind of reaction, it's impossible, because the idea is to be completely agile in questioning and open mind, and to work with others in confidence, with trust. As long as you are, if you are too bunkered in your protection, please don't ask me a question. I'm just a leader. If you have that, you will not have what Stephen said about opening to other people. I had that. Perhaps you see something. My slide. I don't know if it works. It works. Perhaps it's not working. When Corontelli said, "Don't panic about panic. This is not a question. Don't claim immediately everything is under control. Don't bunker in saying to the public, don't do anything. I take everything." And I love your book, Stephen, The Edge of Disaster, when you see that people inside one of the flight took initiatives, but nobody told them in advance what they could have to confront. And I think it's very important. But if you are too bunkered in your defense mechanism, you can't work in today's crisis, and this is a big challenge. We have to change that completely, and this is another approach to exercise, to teaching, and etc. etc. And I recognize instantly people in charge who will be able to face these crises when they tell you the first words. If they are defensive, you know in advance that they can't do anything in the emerging crisis we have to deal with. And this is a terrible problem.
Because of course, I'll come to you, David, and ask you, but of course, the problems you have are scary problems. They are by their nature scary problems. One of the things, because I like many of you, I work in academic. I'm not an academic, but I work in an academic context, but I work in a consultancy context. And one of the things I say to people is, if you have in crisis management, one of the basic rules is, if you have a problem and you can see it from space, you're probably in trouble. Because if it's planetary, then that's bad. And a lot of the issues we're now seeing are planetary. You know, the storms, we're seeing 300-mile-an-hour winds coming. You know, we're seeing sustainable problems. So when I was in the Middle East, when I was in the UAE 10 years ago, 46 degrees was hot and 48 degrees was really the limit of human capability. Now 50 is normal. I mean, that is normal operating environment. How do we run cities at 60 degrees? You know, how do we do that? How do we run cities without water? What happens when, you know, Stephen, the northeast of America, you know, has those storms that come in? What happens if one of those snowstorms lasts for 17 weeks? Which it will do. I mean, there's no reason why not. David, I know that you are specific around risk and disaster reduction, looking at earthquakes and stuff like that. These are scary problems, and the fact that they're scary and we don't want to talk about them doesn't mean they're not going to happen. I mean, they are going to happen, my friends. They, you know, welcome. You know, we look at major city flooding, for example. I mean, I was saying 15 years ago this will happen within our lifetime. That is the reality now. There's no major city without a flooding problem. David?
I was at another webinar this morning about dealing with earthquakes during COVID, with reports from Croatia, Greece, and Turkey. Quite interesting. I wonder if I could bring the conversation back to something you mentioned at the beginning, David, which is community, and therefore necessarily democracy. And a good friend and colleague of mine was invited to dinner by a general in the Pakistani army who had responsibility for post-earthquake reconstruction. And the general said over dinner, "Professor Davis, I'm intrigued by this idea of yours that we should consult the people about reconstruction. We don't consult them about anything else. Why should we consult them about this?" What can you answer to something like that? There's been on the web an interesting discussion in the Radic's discussion group, Radical Interpretations of Disaster, and it's been about the meaning of community. Roberto Barrios of Southern Illinois University, he's an anthropologist and he's got lots and lots and lots of experience of disaster situations. But to stir things up a bit, he asked everyone, what is community and what is its role in disaster? If I may, I'll just rapidly read you what I wrote in reply. And I wrote this: "I know it can be bad practice to argue from the particular to the general, but I'm going to indulge in that luxury. For 15 years, I frequented an ancient town deep in the Apennines of southern Italy. I ended up living there until forced out by the collapse of my rented home in the 1980 earthquake, which incidentally was 40 years ago next Monday. The town has existed in the same place since 1790 BC, despite various vicissitudes such as being razed to the ground for supporting Hannibal rather than Rome in the Second Punic War. The sense of community could not have been stronger. Indeed, it held one in a vice-like grip. It was principally fueled by boredom, isolation, and ancient rancor. The place is spectacularly beautiful. Indeed, it has been repeatedly proposed for UNESCO World Heritage status, but it is far from being a paradise. Despite the sense of identification and pride in heritage that is shared by virtually all of its inhabitants, they cannot shake off the long shadow cast by the divisions of the past. Give everyone an iPad and a Mercedes, and it does not help them escape the legacy of feudalism. Community in such a place is very much a double-edged sword. There is a chronic need for solidarity, and to some extent it is answered by people's actions and affirmations. But there are also major rivalries, jealousies, and a sense of anomie. There is a pervasive sense of helplessness that people can neither escape from nor change this state of affairs as it has existed for too many centuries. People are bound together by alliances and enmities. Economically, they're not particularly poor, but money and acquisitiveness have done nothing to heal all of the divisions. This is a short word portrait of a place that has a strong sense of community, indeed the strongest of anywhere I know, but people there are more bound together by fate than by a sense of shared endeavor. Community in such a place is a suffocating phenomenon rather than an enabling one. So perhaps the lesson of this story, if there is a lesson, is that history is the context of community and often a good key to understanding whether it exists, whether it is therapeutic or whether it is quite the opposite. And by the way, I much enjoyed the Argentinian film El Ciudadano Ilustre, in which a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature goes back to his hometown in rural Argentina. It mercilessly detects the elements of community, the posturing, the hypocrisy, the intolerance, the hopes and fears, even the food and drink. Perhaps that's just a little food for thought.
David, thank you. I mean, you have captured, you know, that suffocating lack of freedom and space within a community. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to ask you, because I want to move on before we finish. We've got another half hour, but I'd like to discuss some academic issues, as we have such, you know, we have academics here. But I'll ask you to sort of sum up what we've done so far. And of course, I think in terms of what you've just described, David, community, the opposite of community is perhaps polarization, which we are clearly seeing in many aspects in you know, many parts of the world. And my feeling is that there's going to be a legacy for that. That is perhaps going to leave scars on our national and global psyche for quite a long time. But in terms of the disaster and risk reduction, which has been a fascinating conversation and could go on for a long, long time. And we really should do this with some beer and some wine on the table. Next time, I will do my best to make that happen. But would you like to have some final thoughts to sum up this section? And then we'll just take 20 minutes or so. There's some specific things I'd like to cover with you on the academic side of things while we're here. Stephen, should we come to you? Anything of just summing up some ideas of where we are, where we're going?
Sure. I mean, I guess really springing off of David's point, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I call this the resilience paradox. Right? What's animating the imperative is we're hyper-connected. And so therefore we have cascading failures that are far more costly and disruptive and fearful. They generate this sort of sense of fear that we've talked about here. The flip side of it is that the way we become more resilient is actually become more connected. But you know, be connected from that narrow parochial sort of community that David was describing here, that can be itself, you know, have built-in brittleness almost because it's so self-contained when there are things that are beyond us. But the core issue is creating networks of systems that can island during extreme events, but reconnect during blue sky days. And so we've got to push much more for decentralization, but not decentralization that leads to isolation, because we have the tools to stay connected, even when we have the, and this comes in the engineering world with things like microgrids that are far more resilient than the big mainframe power grids that we invested in the 20th century. If you can basically provide and the efficiencies that allow renewables and others to allow that grid to support a localized group of players, but then tie into the bigger grid for excess capacity when there's there. But when you have a shock, again, it can self-sustain. There's opportunity, in other words, here in that that we can achieve both greater degrees of centralization but connectedness. But it'll take a lot of effort on our parts here to get to that different place.
A lot of effort, but also a lot of sustained effort. You know, that is just generational, and it's a sustained bit, I think, is the hard bit. You know, it's a tough bit. Thank you for that. Patrick?
Perhaps something on the question, what kind of initiative we could have to promote all these ideas? And probably the best experience I had was an invitation by the Minister of Interior of the Dutch Minister of Interior. They invited 40, 50 people around the world to come on to discuss on mega crises. And the idea was, could you discuss what you have in mind, how you see things? And we had 3 days to go down every single aspect we had in mind. And in the end, it was very intelligent. The Dutch Minister of Interior told us, you will certainly write a book, but you will certainly need 3 years, 1 year before publishing the book. In fact, it was 3 years, mega crises. But please, could you write down within 3 weeks the key points you had discussed during the seminar? It was brilliant because you forced people to go outside their culture, academic culture, and to clarify for people in charge the the most difficult question we had discussed. And in fact, 3 years after we had the book, Mega Crisis, but the idea to ask all these people to come and to share what they didn't know about the mega crisis coming, I think it was absolutely brilliant move. It shows that when people are not frightened, but open to discussion, they create the conditions to weave all these ideas that we are exchanging now to focus and to go on thanks to initiatives. And I think it's very important to create the conditions, the frameworks to permit all these people to go ahead and with the others, not just silos by silos.
We haven't even discussed it, but of course, one of the questions, we have a global roundtable, we have a global coronavirus campfire twice a week. We've had, I think today we're having number 67, we've been doing that since March. But on the very second one in March, the question was, where is the global response? You know, this is a global issue. We've been talking global governance and framework since 1945. Where the hell is the global response? Which is another question for another time. David, let me come to you, and then I want to loop around and just do something else while we've got some time.
We're all very keen on disaster risk reduction. Everybody is. It's a great idea. But I think the problem might well be disaster risk creation. In the fossil fuel business, 1,000 times as much is spent on worsening the problem as is spent on putting it right. There are enormous investments in the discovery, extraction, refinement, and usage of fossil fuels. I read somewhere, and I've forgotten where, and I've lost the reference, that the ratio of cure to damage is 1 to 43 with respect to disasters. I also, therefore, as I've lost the reference, have no idea where they got that number from. They probably plucked it out of nothing, because I don't quite see how one could create that number. But there is something in this whole idea of disaster risk creation, which often has a lot to do with ideological positions, and it certainly has a lot to do with inequality and inequity as well. So those are things we have to work on.
Keep talking, so I need to send a message to somebody. We've got Ed Borojic on here. Ed, great to see you. Actually, Ed, can you just resend to all panelists and attendees? Ed, you sent a great message, but it was to all panelists. Can you resend to all panelists and attendees?